So welcome everyone. Today's guest is Mike Moor. He is a special guest for me because he was my first manager in Microsoft almost about 17 years back. Mike, wow. You interviewed me in Microsoft, you hired me there. And today Mike is Director of Engineering in Groupon, and he spent 15 years in Microsoft, and before that he was in Boeing. So Mike, let's start with what you are doing presently in Groupon and what are the projects you are working, how big is your team, etc.
Well, in Groupon, I run the goods and travel business, which are channels within Groupon. So Groupon's a local business primarily where we enable local merchants. We enable them to connect up, and that attaches customers to merchants. So it's a great discovery tool. It's a great innovation tool. Find out the cool things that are out there. Get them at a price that you can afford so that you can do things that you normally wouldn't be able to do. So Groupon offers it. And Groupon was born out of a time when we had struggles in the economy, 11 years back. And this is a year, of course, this year where you want to be innovative and inspired to go out and do things, and trying to get things bootstrapped with COVID. And so those are the two channels that I own. Have influence on other areas as well. I happen to be blessed with a really great boss that allows me to provide, feedback and coaching up, if you will. Right. I provide input on other areas of the company. And that's kind of the main thing that I do. My team's around 20, which isn't a huge team. I had a much bigger team in previous years, but that sort of varies. Okay. And for me, it's never about the size of the team. It's about the members of the team, and it's about the ownership. In other words, you can build major products with a 10-person team. I learned that in my early years at Microsoft. You can, in many ways, do more with a small team than you do with a big team. It's much trickier to manage a really large team and to make the efficient use of everybody's time. When you have a small team, you really have to prioritize. And the key to me is that every one of my teammates is an owner. Right. Every one of them is an owner. Right. They own what they do. And so they're on the hook for it. They do it like they were running their own little business. So if you happen to have a feature area that's yours, maybe you're a specialist in a financial area. You're working on a financial part of our software. Well, you're the specialist in that area. You're the owner of that. You have input to the features. You have pushback on the feature list and stuff. You have control and influence over the design. You own a big chunk of the pie. And with that ownership, people give you the extra effort, they do the extra work, they deliver much more than they would deliver any other way, and they love what they're doing because they are owners.
True, true. And I was saying at the start of the interview that you are a little special guest for me, not because you are the person who hired me in Microsoft, but you did
hire, by the way. I'm always truthful. I'll call it a top 5 hire. You had top 1. Jane Anduri was on. That was top 1 hire. Yes. So I'll give Jane credit. It was top 1. You're top 5.
Right. Thank you. Jay is in our show also. He was one of the first one. Yes. So why I was saying the special thing is, you not only hired me, you made me dev lead first time, then you made me architect also for Microsoft.com. So interesting about Microsoft.com, I believe that whole thing, Microsoft.com, started from a box under your table. Is that true? Is that the true story?
There was several people, there was 4 people there before me, to be really clear. It was 1995. Right. And one of the people I'd hired at Boeing and had great success moved over there and was part of the site. And there was a team of 4 people on the site. And what they needed was an engineer. And so they had a bunch of great ops folks and stuff like that, and PM and expertise, but what they needed was somebody to be the engineering division. So I joined Microsoft.com as the 5th wheel, and I was the engineering division. So we had the other 4 folks, and I basically wrote the software, designed the software, shipped the software, tested the software, and that was my job. Wow. So I joined as the true engineering division, and then it ballooned from a 5-person team. 3 years later, I'm sitting there with a 100-person team.
True, true. The Microsoft.com, I believe it's all run by you once upon a time, engineering everything. So I was not only promoted to be an architect, and I remember in between you went to sabbatical and you made me manager for some time.
Yes,
so I tasted that position too.
Did a way better job than I ever did, by the
way. So I had this question from, want to ask you, because literally I see you are one of my best managers I ever worked. And so one thing I want to know from you, what people should change about themselves when they get promoted to be a dev lead. And then second part of the question, what they should change when they become dev manager? Because you are a good dev, that's why you got promoted. But then suddenly everything changes about your responsibility and what you should be doing going forward. So give me some tips for dev lead first and then for dev manager.
Well, I'm going to, like I do, is share a story. You can look up an article on Wikipedia, and there's a book about it called The Peter Principle. And what the Peter Principle states is everybody in a hierarchical organization will be promoted to their level of incompetence and then stay there. So they'll never be promoted again.
Right.
So the skills that they have, give them to a particular place, and then they don't go further. The same applies to the move between an IC engineer and to a dev lead and then dev manager.
Right.
It's a very different job.
Right.
In fact, what people don't get is the mental mind shift that's required here.
Right.
You no longer control your own destiny. See, as a developer, it's a control game. There's a love and control. You can come in the morning and have no software, and you can leave at the end of the day and have a piece of software that provides a business function that's working,
right,
that has never been seen before. It's a magic closure that you can take personal ownership of that gives you a level of satisfaction I've never experienced in management.
Right.
There's something special about shipping code. I love code. To me, if you can write code, do it forever. Be drug out of it kicking and screaming, and that was also my model. I got drug out of it kicking and screaming, but it wasn't because I wanted to do that. It's because my number one thing was writing code. My number two thing was, hey, I had a choice to make. We needed to have a manager, and the alternatives, I was the best of the alternatives.
Right.
I wouldn't say we had great alternatives. I was the best of the worst.
Right.
But once I made that transition, I said, okay, right back to the Peter Principle, what's required and is different about being a manager and a dev manager than was required as an IC engineer? Because if you're going to do it, you want to be good at it. If you look at over the years, historically, people went from IC engineer, they were great, they moved them into management, and some were wildly successful, but I would say over half were a disaster. And typically because their mindset hadn't changed. They tried to do the same job and use the same skills that had made them so successful as an engineer, and those are a formula to failure as a manager.
True.
So they had to pivot their mind and say, look, I now have to gain satisfaction and myself out of making others better. How do I empower them to be better than I ever was? How can each member of the team be the best that they're able to be as an individual? And that's when you really do a force multiplier. That's when you really get the leverage. It's not a control, it's actually a giving up of control, and that's the shock and awe for all of us. And I was a control freak.
And
so
that
I was
a
not good.
Very tough thing to do without training and if you're not very aware of.
And we talk about failures, okay? But one of my first biggest failures, the only thing I had going for me was I was open to feedback. I always loved in engineering debating solutions, debating choices, to have an open environment for discussion. The beauty of that is you can fix any of your flaws. And I had an engineer come to me. I still remember him tapping me on the shoulder, indicating you're ruining the team. You're too controlling, you're too directive, you're over the top, you're overbearing, okay?
Right.
We need space. You've got to enable us and give us space. And I took that home and did some soul searching, right? You have to be open to feedback, and you know what? He was right. He was right. I tried to be a control freak, to look into the code, to review the code, to change other people's code. That is disempowering your team members. That's disempowering them. You're not allowing them to do their best. They're like, this control freak, why don't you write the software? You're telling me what to do. That doesn't work. So you're never going to get any kind of scale.
That's a very good tip, that give up the control.
You know what woke me up to was I can't scale. As an individual developer, you can only write so much software in a given day.
True.
It doesn't matter how many years you do this, you're probably only going to do 25, 50 good lines of quality code a day.
Yep.
Whatever language you're on may make more business features than that 50 lines of code. That's your upper limit. Doesn't matter who you are or how long you work at it. So, that puts a throttle on your capability. So what you need is to scale. You're not going to be able to scale. You'll never have any time off. You'll never be able to think about things more broadly or longer term. So you've got to get other people to do a better job than you did at the work that you were doing before, and be an enabler and a supporter. So you have to shift from a controller to a supporter. So you've got to be bottoms up. I was top down controller, and I went to servant leader. Now it wasn't a fix overnight. It took time. But I was able to take the feedback and make the adjustments and improve over a period of time.
True. So you just mentioned, passing by, about your management philosophy, servant leader.
Yep.
So I would like to know, what is your management philosophy, and if you can talk a little more about it. What do you mean by servant leader?
Servant leader is, it's all employee first. And it's easy to say that, it's actually hard to do that. And what that means is, I take all of the blame when things go poorly, and give all of the credit when things go well. So really, just like a coach of a professional sports franchise, you would need to be that kind of a coach on the field for your team.
Right.
Which means your team is comfortable taking risk, knowing you've got their back, no matter what happens. Because if you won't support people, they'll stop taking risks, they won't push hard, they'll get demoralized, and they won't do their best work, and they won't give their best effort. I mean, optimism, I always say, hope dictates effort. If people have hope and see a direction, here's where we need to go, but I'm not going to tell you how to get there. I want you to be the owner and figure out how we're going to get there, but here's what we want to accomplish. Please help us figure out how you want to implement that and you want to accomplish it, and let them innovate. And here's a key tip for you, which I haven't seen in anybody else's video, so I think it's something unique. Don't limit your people by your own limitations. Most managers limit their staff by their own limitations. My mental of the model of the world is my mental model of the world. It's nobody else's.
True.
It's my truth, not the truth, it's my truth.
Right.
Knowing that, then you're like, you know what? You've got to allow them to develop. You got to allow them to learn, allow them to take risks, allow them to make mistakes. And then you use those as coaching moments, not in a public forum, but you just kind of go aside and say, here's a risk that you took that didn't work out. Was there things you could have done to mitigate it that would have given you a higher chance of success?
Right.
But I love the obvious to you is obvious to you.
True.
That came out of the Brain Rules book. You can look it up. And it means that our view of the world is framed by our own experiences.
By own
and it's
experiences.
different. But also remember I said, don't limit others by your own limitations. Most managers do that. In other words, they have a mental model of how fast somebody can learn, how fast they can grow, how fast they can. Why would you put those limitations on somebody else? They may not have those limitations.
True.
So get the heck out of the way. Let them go at their own pace, which may be far faster than you ever imagined. They could be far superior than you ever were.
True.
And that's a little tough on the ego, going, man, this developer is a lot better than I ever dreamed of being.
Right.
But that's when they have their best work. That's when they have breakthroughs.
True.
And so that was a really big pivot for me as I was scoping. And I probably only picked that up in the last 5 years.
Right.
Where I changed my coaching philosophy to no longer put limits on people's development speed.
True.
I'd say, you know what, some people can go through the program that I like to teach. Usually takes 12 to 18 months. Some people can do it in 6 months.
Yeah.
And my model was they can never do it in less than 12 months. Not true.
Right.
There's some people that are so spectacular and are so hardworking and are so dedicated and work so smart that they're able to do things that I was never able to do.
True. In fact, I remember this dialogue. You used to say it so often that it just engraved in me that get heck out of the way. If you hire the smart people, why the hell you are, try to micromanage and figure it out? Just get out of the way. And that mantra I also took and all my time in Microsoft, and after that also, I do believe that's what you should do. Hire smart people and then just leave them. And so that's really good.
Let's make one small tip here that's really good, and this is out of a John Wooden book. Differentiate the difference between teaching and coaching. There's a big difference here, and it's very, very important. Is we normally try to coach people. You can't coach what hasn't been taught. You have to learn first. You have to teach first. Once you've taught somebody, then you can coach and steer. But if they don't know the core techniques, the core fundamentals, the data models, how to build object models, if they don't have the core capabilities, you're trying to coach somebody, they're not going to be successful. And that's where coaches get frustrated. The person's not able to do it. Well, you know what usually the problem is? They don't have the skills that you expect them to have. So you've got to teach them the skills. Once they have the skill set to be able to do the job well, now you can coach. But people try to coach when the person doesn't have the skills.
Yes, that's very important. So another thing you said just now, which is very important, and I want to dig deep a little bit, because I also realize just very, too late in my life though, that the most amount of harm is done to me by my own limitations, my own ego, I'm my biggest enemy. That's what I realized, and that the realization came out of my financial dealing and trying to be smart in stock market and all that. And then I realized, man, the most amount of harm I did by myself because thinking that I know too much. So you talk.
Well, you hit on something there that you've got to remain humble.
True.
The more humble you remain, and it's right out of the Principles book by Ray Dalio. You hear me quoting stuff all the time. That you sort of have to have principles and you have to remain humble. And big failures will humble you.
True.
But the sooner you become humble, the better it is for you. My experience in China, working for a year and a half, I worked with some of the smartest engineers I worked for, and people were humble. It was a cultural element to be great team players and to be humble. And when I lived in that environment and realized, you know what? I got folks coming in here that are billionaires, coming in working 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, just like the rest of us, sitting with the rest of us, doing everything with the rest of us. They're humble. Some of the most brilliant people I've ever met, they're absolutely humble. And I realized, you know what, there's a lot of benefits from being humble.
Right.
Because I think when you were humble, you listen better. I think I listened and learned and really took in input better when I sort of humbled myself and sort of kept the ego under control. Early in my career, I let the ego get out of control. And frankly, I was rewarded for it in a lot of ways. But as I matured over time, I realized that that also puts ceiling and limit conditions on your ability to advance. Because some of the things that were a strength at my job level, where I was at, became a weakness. Remember I talked about the Peter principle, that you have to reassess skills on every promotion. You've got to do a complete reassessment, and you may have to do major surgery, because here's what I would challenge you. If you get promoted and you don't have to reinvent yourself, it wasn't a real promotion. You should have been there already.
Yes.
You should have been there already. The test of a promotion is if you have to fundamentally reassess, study more, study others, study what they've done, learn the new space. If you're not having to do that, either you're going to be poor at that, and you're going to be stuck at that level because you're never going to be any good at it, or you're going to thrive. In other words, once you again being humble, my skills that got me to level 2, level 3 aren't getting me to the next level. Those could become limit conditions for my next move.
Exactly.
So you're always thinking 2 promos ahead, current promo in the next one, and you're always thinking, okay, what are the gaps that I have? Who are the best people in the job at the next level I see? What is strong about them and what is different? The other thing, as you mentioned, which is as you go up, think about management in 3 dimensions. People don't tend to think of it in 3 dimensions, but there's really 3 dimensions to management. Managing down, which is what you are at a level 1 manager. Most of your time is managing down. There is a little bit of time managing out, but a lot of times that's handled by the person next up from you. So there's a little bit of managing out, there's a little bit of managing up. But now as you become 2nd level, now you have to do all 3 well. You have to manage down effectively, you have to manage out effectively, and you have to manage up effectively. And you know what? All 3 of those are vastly different skill sets. You actually require drastically different skill sets. And probably the most important skill to develop is you got to learn to change your communication to the needs of the audience that you're talking with. So if you're dealing with business leaders, you have to master business terminology so that you're talking to them in a language that they can understand and they can be at their best. You don't want each person working with you have to reverse engineer what you're trying to say. What you've got to do is say, if I'm dealing with a technical audience, I can talk about code and APIs and all this kind of stuff. Senior managers don't care about any of that stuff. So what the challenge is to say, when I'm going out, what matters to those? How are their teams successful? How can they contribute? How do you make them successful? How do we bring us all along? And then when you manage up, people don't want any surprises. How do we make sure the bosses are never surprised? They never get blindsided from the top coming down. That you're setting them up. What are their OKRs? What are they being measured on? What is their view of success? And how are you enabling them to be successful? And notice you have to do a real-time pivot depending on the audience that you have. And that's the skill set that you have to develop. And it's very different managing out. And you know what? You will see managers, and watch this. Now that you're thinking about it, everybody that's out there, think about this. Look at managers who manage down brilliantly, who manage out brilliantly, and manage up brilliantly, and they're almost always not the same person. So your challenge as a manager, if you really want to be the best version of yourself, is to learn to do all three really well. And each one is critically important, because think about it. If I'm building a system and I'm managing down my team's delivery, I'm managing out, so I'm bringing all my partners along, but I have not set executive management expectations, we're going to be seen as a failure. We can deliver the best product in history and will be perceived as a failure because perception is reality. So you have to manage the perception of the work, not just the work itself. So you have to communicate in a way that your boss can communicate, what are you doing, why are you doing it, how does it align with company objectives, what's the benefit, and what was the effort required to get it there. Don't make it look too easy. If you make it look too easy, nobody assumes anything went into it. So I love this framing. They always say the hardest part's making it look easy. That's beautiful at the engineering levels. Don't do that when you go to managing up, or people take it for granted.
So I wanted to ask you this follow-up question on your initial statement on don't impose your limitation on the team. How I will know about my own limitation? That's very difficult, I feel. People don't know. There's a blind spot. So
you have to look at, it's one of the most painful things that you have to do, but you have to look at yourself, and you may not like what you see. So I got to tell you, you have to get comfortable really doing a retro on your own decision making. You need to do your own retro, and you actually need to have an environment with your employees that they're comfortable to give you honest and potentially painful feedback. I won't tell you what the employee told me, but basically told me I was a disaster as a manager. In nice words. But the beauty of it was,
when did that happen?
that was at Boeing. So I was just sort of starting to explore a little bit of management, even back in my Boeing days. I also got that again in my Microsoft era. I was making some of the same mistakes because I'd never gotten good at it.
Right.
But it was only when I was actually willing to look within. I mean, it's hard to say, but you have to look at yourself and you have to be honest with yourself.
And that's the only way, I believe. There's no other way to know your own limitation. Right?
It's right out of the Ray Dalio book on principles, right? Which is, don't view the world as you want it to be. Try to view the world more as it really is. In order to do that, you sort of need multiple people's viewpoint on it, and you need to be humble enough to say that your point of view is a biased point of view. The only question is how much bias is there and how many dimensions to the bias is there. But knowing that means you're going to get other points of view. And you want people to give you honest feedback and real-time feedback, timely feedback. You know, if you make a mistake or say, you know, one of my issues was over time I've been developing executive presence because I'm an engineer at heart. My passion and my energy and my interest are really an engineer at heart. You know, the business is critically important, and I love that as well, but I really love engineering at the core. And so I was too geeky. And that doesn't work for executive presence because I'm rambling on about technical stuff that nobody in the room cares about. It's just distraction from them. It's imposing cognitive load on the rest of the audience, and frankly, they just tune you out. So I realized, you know what, how you communicate it, and the other thing I do is I turn the passion up and down now. I choose, and I usually use the passion part of my repertoire when I'm working with employees because I want to inspire them and give as much as I can so they do their best work. But when I deal with executive management, I just turn that off. I got to just put it into calm, put it into neutral, facts and data, what do we need to do, how do we need to do there? And that took me, I've only developed that in the last 3 or 4 years.
That's a very, very important thing because I realize like I see you as the most positive person and you know you can inspire anybody and high energy and all that, and you are saying you are turning off the passion when you are having a meeting on the seniors. Wow, that's very important because they are not interested
because they'll tune you out. In other words, they don't want to see some animated engineering manager blabbing his gums about some technical stuff that's irrelevant.
Very important.
They're interested in how are you going to make their business successful? How are you going to make money? How are you going to increment gross profit, gross bookings? How are you going to sell more units? You've got to then change your language to what matters to them, and you've got to pivot the technology. What does it enable? What are the business scenarios that it enables? And so you're having to change. Notice you're changing what you say to the audience that you have. And that to me, I only developed in the last few years. So I've been doing this over 30 years, and I didn't develop that skill until recently. And so that's why you always have to get better every day, right? Every single year you want to be a little bit better than the previous version.
These are golden words, I will say. This is very, very good tip. So we'll change a little bit the gear here. Mike, you are managing big engineering team, complex projects, products in Groupon, Microsoft and all. And you've seen everything from waterfall because you were in Boeing too. And they may be the king of waterfall.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, nobody did waterfall. You know,
like them. And from there now to Groupon, where you have a small, fast moving team.
I was on a team where you'd have a 12-foot wide specifications. And the specifications, I would write what's called a technical document that had all the APIs, all the interfaces, all the data types, what's coming in, what's coming out, so that the goal was any engineer you hire can develop it. It's so spec'd out at such a technical level that any engineer could build it. The problem is you've completely eradicated the innovation from the engineer. Let me add a tip here. So the perfect engineer, in my view, is a beautiful combination of innovation on one dimension and discipline on the other, in constant tension. I want to innovate, but I also want to have high availability, high scalability, high reliability systems. So you want a healthy tension between innovation and discipline. And I would ask each engineer of where do they fall on that continuum. Some engineers are going to be a little more on the innovation side. That's what they enjoy doing. That engineer might be a great fit for a startup, right? If you try to squeeze them into a mature company that's just discipline or a financial application, they may be terrible and be seen as a failure. You put that same person leading an innovation on a startup and they're wildly successful. So notice how the same set of skills depend on circumstance. So where you fit on that matters, and make a decision. In other words, if I'm more about discipline than innovation, how can I make myself more aware of things that go on in the industry so I can come up with ideas? On the other hand, if I'm too innovation, I may not ship. So how do I become reasonably disciplined so I become a balanced engineer that has a mix of those? And in fact, I would argue project to project, you move that a little bit. But here's the thing, imagine if an engineer understands the way that they think and can adjust and say, you know what, this is an innovation project. Here's my chance to shine in terms of bringing up new ideas.
Right.
Oh, this is a financial project. It has to be perfect in the MVP. The very first version must be perfect because maybe it's got tax laws and stuff like that.
Right.
So there's very little wiggle room there. So here I need to be much more disciplined and rigorous, or like I'm using extreme user volume, millions of users a second, that type of thing. I might need extreme discipline. But on the other hand, I might have a project where it's all about innovation.
Right.
So it's all about knowing yourself. Where do you land on that continuum?
Right. So you are agile there, also changing your everything. So that was my question actually. So what engineering best practices you follow? And out of all this experience, you must have distilled few of the things which you don't compromise on.
Well, the first thing I would say is that everything that's old is new again.
Right.
What I see is things, I won't mention any names, but I see things renamed that we were doing 40 years ago.
True.
So I see things that we were taking for granted and doing agilely 40 years ago that are now renamed and now it's somehow novel. But you know what? Originally I was kind of critical of that, just renaming something, but there is an advantage to renaming. And the advantage is that it's then seen as new, and it may not have as much baggage coming along with it that you'll get if you use the term that you used to use.
Right.
So for me, I do love Scrum because it sort of says, look, we want to have a goal.
Yep.
We want to have something output. We want to hold ourselves accountable to some minimal level of output. Okay, so I do tend to like Scrum. I do Scrum with a twist, which is my teams are business focused. We're not technology for technology. We're business first, technology second.
Right.
And in doing that, what we do is we also realize, because it's kind of a fast moving company and things move around, we also are willing to move things around within a sprint. Now that seems a little crazy, but sometimes it matters. Sometimes there's a priority. So the order of the items in the sprint, I tell the PMs you can move those orders. As long as the developer hasn't started working on a particular task yet, you can move the order, just work with the developer, move the order and say, you know what, I need this fix in quicker than other fixes. I can't wait till the end of the sprint cycle. Please do it now. And off you go. Now notice we're not rescoping the sprint, we're just resequencing the sprint.
I'm just wondering, do you follow the Kanban method or Scrum, or you have your own mix
I would say it's a hybrid between Scrum with a little Kanban within the Scrum. So in other words, it's Scrum overall because it gives you a little bit of structure, a little bit of organization, which I love that part of it, right? You sort of do the stands in some fashion, you know. I'm not a purist on this.
Right.
What it's about is, can you have meaningful deliveries that make a difference on your business on your Scrum intervals? In other words, can you see some output that somebody cares about that matters, that you can say, you know what, our last 2 weeks were well done, there was a good value, there was something to be benefit. But I'll give you an idea where I'll be flexible. I love retros, because retros combined with Scrum gets you this continuously improving process over time where you just keep getting better and better and better. However, I'm not doing retros in the last few months. Now, why? Right now, the amount of work that we have in front of us is very, very heavy. And we have a relatively small team doing it. So the amount of work is very, very heavy. If I bring retros in, I'm going to create false expectations of improvements that we're not going to actually make because they require work, they require investment. And we're so strapped at the moment to finish the work that's in front of us, it's not the right time to do retros. Right. Now, when we hit a little more stable state, which I'm expecting toward the end of the year, early next year, we'll bring back in retros. I've also sort of eased up on sprint points. I'm more of number of tasks to get done because you take a lot of time to come up with those sprint points. A lot of debate goes on in those sprint points, and I love sprint points because it certainly is a useful measure of output. So you want to I look at each thing in the process and say, what's the value add? And if the value add is greater than what it costs you to do the work, then do it. But be willing to make modifications. I think that's the thing is that you sort of have a framework, and then you adjust to optimize what's most important. And for us, it's business output. What's the most features we can deliver with quality in the least amount of time with the size of team that we have.
Okay.
Because think about it, you're always saying, what is my statement of work? What is my manpower? And what's my schedule? Those are sort of the dimensions that you have to play with. Typically, you can't move the manpower very fast because you have to have ramped manpower. So it's not just another developer, it's a ramped developer if you're working in a domain that requires expertise.
Right.
So you're not going to be able to move that much, which means the movable part really is the statement of work.
Right.
Really the statement of work controls it. So when we talk to our program manager, product managers, we say, well, what do you want in what sequence? And people don't like to prioritize because they're giving something up, but you want to get people to get comfortable prioritizing. And I'll share one other story that I filled in as a surrogate PM in my early days at Microsoft, and I was terrible. So I'm a person that has deep respect for program managers. I can say the happiest day of my life was when I got dedicated program management at Microsoft. The people that do this for a profession. So to me, the engineering job is the most fun, and I think the easiest job. I hate to say that, but in my opinion, because there's so much joy. I love engineering.
Yep, I agree with you.
Program management, when done well, is a painful, thankless job that has to be done. It is difficult, and you're not a hero doing it.
Right.
And so I love being the hero. You know, the developers are the heroes, right?
Yes, yes.
The program managers are the goats. They're having to share the hard, it's a tough job that has to be done. And so here's what I did when I was program managing, so you guys can laugh at this a little bit. So my biggest issue with development is doing work that gets thrown away. It's intolerable. Of all the things you say, I'm not very rigorous on anything. I tend to be flexible, except for building stuff that doesn't ship. Everybody loses when you build capability, and it's inexcusable. It's inexcusable, especially with Sprint, where you're doing everything every couple of weeks or so, to build software that never ships. Why did you build it? You got a serious prioritization problem. So what I did is, I said, you know what? We're only doing P0 work. And so I remember some VPs, this is in the early era, some VPs sitting in the room, and I would list all the P0s we're working on. And then I would talk, you know, and then I stopped at the end of the P0s. And I remember one of the VPs going, well, when are you getting to the P1s and P2s? When they become P0s. The issue was prioritization, prioritization, prioritization. People don't like to prioritize. They don't like to compromise. That's the job. That's really the variable you control. Developers usually don't. Developers can do great work. Typically, when they're struggling, it's all about the management. It's almost never about the engineers. If you really root cause it, it's all about the leadership, and usually it's about lack of vision and lack of prioritization.
True.
Prioritize, because if you prioritize, you can get a lot of output on the right features. The most disaster is to build good work and not have a ship. No business value, no benefit. And you know, you demoralize your team, and the next time you need them to put in extra effort, you're not going to get it.
Yes.
Because they wasted their time. So prioritization is everything.
I agree with you. So I want to know another thing about, you know, because people often talk about in Agile, we are doing Agile, so there's no need for any kind of documentation and all. Where do you stand on the documentation in an Agile way of doing things in terms of, you know, what functional spec, tech spec, BRD we should have?
You got to look and see what the nature of the software is, which is, how long is the feature going to last? What's the life cycle of the software? How many generations beyond you are going to have to maintain it over how long a period of time?
Right.
If we're building software that's kind of an innovation case that we're sort of trialing out, then you're much more willing to make compromises and to shortcut the documentation. But if you're building something that needs to last, or financial software that you've got to be able to be audited on, you have to have the documentation, because what documentation is, some level of documentation. And the code is not enough. It's certainly better with modern languages, but it's generally not enough. You at least need a context diagram. The minimum level documentation would be a context diagram of how a system fits in and what are the interfaces to other systems. If you've got that, then an engineer that's trying to ramp has an idea of what's going on. If you don't do that, think about how much you're killing them off in the ramp time. In other words, the ability to bring another engineer on to help you out is vastly compromised. The other dimension would be, what's the complexity of the business domain? If you're in a domain that ends up being pretty complex and a pretty heavy ramp, for example, when I joined Groupon, I didn't know supply chain logistics. That's an empire of its own. That's a big ramp. And so the documentation on what had been done and what was known was very helpful. Now, when you don't have a lot of documentation, I love video. So what you do is you get the experts in a room and you get your questions together and you just start you take video and video and video. So we make very heavy use of video as opposed to written documentation.
I agree with you. I'm seeing in myself, in my company itself, we are moving to a lot of recording the meetings and just posting that in place of writing a lot of documentation.
Yes, because you're doing both at the same time, and it's a better media for somebody to understand. So I'll give you an example. We had an engineer that was leaving that's a tremendous engineer, been there like 7-8 years, had deep domain expertise. We had 25 recorded sessions with that engineer in the 2 weeks before he left the company.
Right.
And that was to capture the knowledge. If we were trying to do that in writing, we would have gotten 1%. We probably got 80% coverage, and we feel very comfortable, even though he was deep expert by doing the videos. And then we watched them back. So it's not enough to just do them. You actually have to invest the time to watch them back and to learn something from it. But that's the way you capture the knowledge for eternity. If you don't, the videos to me is a great alternative to a bunch of written documentation. But given a choice, I'd love an architecture diagram. Or if you're going to do a major design change, it's nice to see what's the old design, what's the new design, and how do we get there. Because without the documentation, or at least some diagram, at least a diagram of how these things work, how do you get real input from other people that don't know the domain?
Exactly.
If they can understand the domain, at least conceptually, they may be able to offer something to your design, and you're going to end up with a better system than you would if you do it. You always get better systems if you have the larger number of voices, the better systems you get.
Yep.
And the more diversity, the more differences among the people, the different backgrounds they have, the more feedback you get, the better solutions you get. So you need enough to be able to ramp the next generation. It also matters how much turnover you're getting. If you're at a company that happens to be experiencing a lot of turnover, you better have a lot more documentation than you would need if you have stability over many years. If the people are around, okay, if the domain expertise sticks around together over long periods of time, the value of the documentation isn't the same. But if they're turning over, it becomes priceless.
True.
So again, notice I'm saying you always have to have it with a purpose. Notice I'm not saying lots or poor is right. What's the right sizing of the documentation?
And what is
artifacts
the purpose?
do you need for the use cases that you have and the nature of the business you're in?
True.
And you should be able to say, you know what, I've protected this company for the next decade. Whoever succeeds, in other words, always be thinking about your replacement. Who's going to replace your engineers? Who's going to replace you? Are you making the world a better place for them coming in to make it easier for them to ramp, understand, master, and then add value quickly? If you're not doing that, then you're stealing from the next generation.
True.
You've got to make an easier path for the next generation than it was for you. And when you do that, when you leave a company, you can leave with a clean conscience.
True.
You want to leave a company better than when you joined it. And that's something I've always taken deadly serious, that you always want to, especially in this era, everybody's interconnected. If you leave a company and you burn some bridges, those people are going to remember you, and that's going to disrupt your career later on, because they'll tell all their friends, and the world is so interconnected now, somebody finds out. Imagine if you flip it and say, I always say to the person, the most important thing you ever do in your career is the transition when you leave a job.
Yes.
The transition is everything. You want to make it like you were never there. Because how do they remember you? They're like, this dude came in, protected us, took care of the company, transitioned seamlessly, trained the new staff. It was like they never left.
Yeah.
And they look at you, and they'll remember that for eternity. They'll tell all their friends 20 years in the future, when you need that serious job and you need that voter in your corner, they're going to be there for you, because they're going to say, you know what, they took care of me. And that's an integrity issue for me. You've taken care of the company. You've not left it in bad shape. You've left it in better shape than when you joined.
True, agreed, completely agree. So Mike, in this long career, I'm guessing maybe you have hired hundreds of people in Microsoft, and some of your hires are really good. I can vouch for that.
I would argue at least 90%.
Yes.
But not 100%, but certainly 90% I think is fair.
So what do you look for when you are interviewing? Technical and personal, leadership quality, what are things you look for?
Well, hiring's a passion for me. I wrote like a 30-page document on hiring and all the nuances and stuff at my current company that we sort of look for, because there's quite a bit to it. There's more to it than meets the eye. But I start with Bill Gates, something I learned from him in the early days. It used to be called the Bill Gates 2, which became the Bill Gates 3. What he was looking for, and this is in the early days, so let's go back in the 90s. He was looking for engineers that had high horsepower and high energy. So there's somebody that's able to learn, able to handle interactive conversation, is willing to learn, willing to study, and is able to communicate. High energy, they're willing to work. So you can be brilliant and not willing to work, and what good are you? And then what he said is, this was great from Bill, what he said is, I was hiring too many doctorates, they were geniuses and stuff, but didn't ship anything. Because shipping software, as we all know, is hard. You have to make compromises. And if you're a perfectionist, it's very hard to ship.
Right.
So he realized, I need a third one. High horsepower, high energy, gets things done. So somebody that's actually able to make the hard trade-offs required to ship. So he added a third dimension, and then I added a fourth dimension that I figured something else to me that's the most important of all the dimensions of all. And what I refer to it as professional integrity, which means that the person's committed to being great at what they do. They're not going to be just okay. They want to be great. They want to be the best version of themselves. When you have that, you're golden. And I would say that a lot of times people want that high horsepower. I would much prefer, which I would classify myself as medium horsepower, high energy, gets things done, and extreme professional integrity. Extreme professional integrity. Meaning absolute, now remember I talked about ownership, which means if you don't know what you're doing, you're going to learn, you're going to humble yourself, you're going to get other people, you are not going to be satisfied failing over and over again. You're going to get other people to help. And if you get those things in a hire, you're on your way. And then I'll add the extra dimension, which you don't see people listing on a lot of these videos. The more important even more important than hiring is developing. Is what are you going to do to develop the next generation of engineers? And my favorite example of that would be, I observed something very interesting early in my career, and it occurred across multiple companies, so I know that this is repeatable. You hire any computer science engineer, good engineer out of college, worked hard, learned engineering, knows how to write software. You hire them into a company. You pair that person with a great coach and mentor, they're on their way. They're going to double the average promotion velocity. You take the same engineer, put them with a poor coach or manager, they're going to be managed out in 2 years. That's the same person. So was it a hiring mistake? No, it was a developmental mistake.
Yeah.
It's all about developing. So you can literally take anybody you have and get a lot out of them. And a recent example was at a company I recently joined. I hired where one of the engineers was pointed out to me in my introduction, I was going to manage, as the worst engineer in the group. In an organization about 100 people, that's the worst engineer, has no chance of, no potential. And so to me, my eyes just sparkled. I went, oh, now we're talking. And my point being is that I'm a coach. And so when you see somebody maybe struggling a little bit, it's all about the coaching. And it turns out what oftentimes happens is people are in the wrong role. They're in the wrong role, or they don't understand what's really expected of them, and they need those expectations set, and they also need teaching. In other words, he hadn't had some of the background issues that were needed for him to be successful. And so what I did is parked his desk next to mine, went through the patterns and practices training and stuff that I do with all the engineers that I work with and stuff, and started developing him. And I told the manager, I expect him to go from the worst to best in 1 year's time, and that's exactly what he did. Ripped through SD2, SD3, was on the verge of SD4, and then basically broke the bank in terms of money at his next job.
Right.
And all that he needed was to change roles a little bit. He was doing a role that he wasn't well suited for, and to be unleashed.
Right.
Somebody that got out of the way.
Right.
Got out of the way and let him flourish.
Right.
And that dude is on his way. And that's been repeated over and over and over
I
again.
think that's a very important tip. I will take it very personally because I think I was missing that understanding that more than hiring a good person, it's more about developing somebody who is even on an average person, but you can turn them into a geniuses.
And don't limit them. Remember I said don't limit them by your own limitations. You give somebody that has just some computer science background. So usually, we like people with a degree, but the alternative to that is I've had people be successful that were hobbyists. In other words, they do computing because they love it.
Right.
This is their hobby. This is what they do. Some of those are the best developers you'll ever find. They never went to college for writing software. But they could have written the books that are in college because all they did was study, because you have the vast internet now where you can study anybody and everybody that's out there.
True.
They just attach themselves to great engineers everywhere and are 12, 14, 18 hours a day. Look at the hours. They usually figure it takes 10, 20,000 hours to master a domain. All of a sudden they got that in there in 3 or 4 years.
Right.
In college, you only get a couple thousand hours a year, and usually you're diversified, right? Even computer science, you're not spending very much time in computer science, really.
Right.
Compared to if somebody was doing that on their own full time, no comparison. They're a specialist that's what they love. They can be wildly successful. True. So again, don't limit them. See what they're able to do, see examples of what they're able to do, and then get the heck out of the way. And then just provide developmental coaching, and then, like I said, teaching. And we'll get into patterns and practices maybe a little bit later, but that's one of the teaching mechanisms you can do. Because what you want people to do is to love engineering. And so I would say the most important thing with hiring is integrity and honesty.
True.
If you hire somebody that has integrity and honesty, they will look at themselves and determine, I can't actually function at this job. Maybe you give them a shot, and they're like, you know what, it's really not for me.
Right.
What's wrong with that? You have the honest discussion, help them find a job that's a better fit for them.
True. True.
Remember I said that context matters. You can take the same developer. You take an innovation developer and put them in a mature company, they're probably going to struggle.
Right.
On the other hand, you take a hardcore financial engineering engineer, data-centric engineer, and put them in a startup, and the same person under different circumstances is seen as failing.
Yes.
And this also ties back to situational leadership, right? If you think about situational leadership, it's all about figuring out where a person is relative to a particular type of task.
Exactly.
Okay? Notice if you study situational leadership, you realize that it's not about the individual, it's about the task. Maybe you're an expert in one type of coding, but you're a novice in data or financial engineering, which is a very different pivot on that. Well, you need different types of developmental coaching if you're junior in that domain. True. So in other words, you're an expert in the space that you're in, or a UI expert, but you're going into back end, you're going into something very different. You simply need to be developed in that dimension. Now, there's a few people out there that refuse to fail. Those are the very, very rare ones, and everybody's looking for those, and not very many of them around. And those are folks that'll just do whatever it takes and are able, have high horsepower, and you're just able to do it. True. Those people exist, they're rare. Most of us are everybody else.
True.
So what you have to do is say, how can I take really any engineer that I bring in and make them wildly successful, the best version of themselves, and you'll be shocked at how much you can get out of every engineer you can ever hire.
True, true. So, Mike, we all know that you are a very successful person. I know you used to have the fastest and most latest model of, sports car and all that. But I want to know about your failures. Your personal failure, because everybody else knows all about your success. Yep. So can you talk about your failures?
Well, I'll do my, it's a long list. Okay, because if you're willing to do a lot, you're willing to have a lot of failures. The more surface you cover, the more failures you're going to have. You can do nothing and never fail. But if you do a lot and take a lot of risk, and in fact, I would argue if you're never failing, you're not taking any risk. So don't fool yourself into saying, no, you're not risk taking. If you're risk taking, you're out there and you're making mistakes, learning and adjusting. So if you're going to fail fast, learn and move. But my first failure was job choice. So when I came out of college, I could have gone to Boeing or I could have gone to Microsoft. Had offers on both dimensions. And Microsoft was the up-and-coming company. This is pre-IPO, by the way, pre-stock era. Windows 1.0, so it's kind of the early days. And my buddy went to Microsoft, and I loved the manager at Boeing more than the one that I interviewed with at Microsoft. And so I chose manager. And most people will take manager over job when they have a choice, right? The best managers over here, the best jobs over here. I went with manager. Also, Boeing Computer Services at the time was thriving. There's 20,000 people. They had all kinds of cool stuff. So it was actually a cool company. But a realization of that was my buddy, who was number 2 in our, we always had a little friendly competition. I finished 1, he finished 2, close second. He's retired in 10 years. So I find out at a party and stuff that this dude's retired. And I remember, because I'm competitive, right? I remember kind of, realizing I'm kind of struggling away here. I've been here like 8 years and I'm making a little bit of money and stuff and doing okay. And I remember going, and you rationalize, right? You try to, the competitive nature of it got, and I remember laying in bed and I remember saying to myself, what difference would $10 million make? And then I just sat up. A lot of difference.
$10 million.
A lot of difference. That's generational money. That's a big difference. And that was the wake-up call that it was also my time to move on.
Right.
So I realized, the opportunity and the growth potential and stuff and the upper end of what you could do was greater. And so I ended up I had hired a lot of developers and they moved on to Microsoft. And I decided at that point in 1995, then I went over to help them out with Microsoft.com website. So that was a good move for me. But that was the first devastating mistake. Now, on the flip side is I learned a lot from that manager, who was a fabulous manager, and I learned a lot. So it made me a better manager in future years. So there's a pro and a con. The other thing is, just because I chose that doesn't necessarily mean I would have been wildly successful at Microsoft at that time.
True.
I didn't have the same skill set that I came in as an 8-year war-hardened veteran of Boeing. I was war-hardened. So I was a very different person when I went there. So I would say there was no guarantee. It would have all been dependent on what role I had got in. So the cool thing was I fully was largely developed, went over there and was able to write some software and have some success there, and it was a good move for me. So that was the first big failure. And then one of my most humiliating one, and this is one that I'll probably never get over, but it changed me as a coach, probably more than any other, is I had a kind of a mental model of how to build teams. And that was you hire a few stars like yourself, Jay, and others. You sort of hire a few stars that are great coders, great developers, great designers, great leaders, and then you hire role players. So in other words, you have stars and role players. That was kind of the model I was using, 20 years ago. And that had worked well for me. I mean, the model had worked, not surprisingly. You get some, you got a few stars, they tend to carry your team a little bit to some extent, and they bring others along and help develop the rest of your team. And then I was given a job which was a team that was struggling to deliver. So they hadn't really delivered all that much, and I was asked to kind of turn this thing around a little bit. And their manager at the time had moved on. And I did some background, and I knew a lot of the members of the team. And I remember my assessment was, that I didn't have a star. So I looked at the team and I looked around and kind of, in my mind, my model had a flaw here. In other words, I needed a star on the team to be the person that led the rest of the team from a technical standpoint, right? It was grinding the code every day, and I didn't have that. And so what I was doing was I kind of shook things up, and I told people at a meeting, this is what we're going to expect. We're going to be a team that ships. We're predictable. We ship on time. That's what I expect from you guys. That's what we need to be successful here. And if you don't want to be part of that, you might want to consider moving on. So again, notice the youngness of my approach there. And I was direct and I was honest, but probably too honest in that case. Now, so I had new headcount. I'm starting to hire. I'm bringing people in through interview loops, and I get hit with a hiring freeze. So now I've rattled the cages on an existing team, right? Here's the new dude showing up, and he's already rattled the cages saying, hey, maybe you don't want to be here, right? Unless you're, in the program. And now I'm gonna have to eat some, I'm gonna have to eat some serious crow here, okay? Because I can't hire anybody. So here's the wake-up call for me. My model of hiring stars and building around a star or two and building all around it is now fatally flawed. I'm not gonna be able to hire anybody.
Right.
I just got hit by a hiring freeze. All the people I had that were already in the loop are gone. So now I have to win with who's in front of me.
Right.
Right? So now this is a different coaching problem. Because again, my model, remember, hire the star and let everybody follow the star, right? Kind of like a pro basketball team. You get LeBron James and get a bunch of role players. Same thing with pro sports. But then I realized, you know what? I had to apologize to the team, tell them I was out of line. What I said was stupid. And I asked people to forgive me and to stick with me and find a way to be successful together. And that was a turnaround when I learned to coach anybody. I needed to learn to coach anybody. Right. And I realized it's not all about cherry picking. It's not really as much about, it's developing, and that's when I had to learn to start developing people. How do you get people together and be able to share ideas so that you don't actually need any superstars?
True.
Because the aggregate of the team was superstar.
Right.
But the aggregate intelligence together was superstar level. Any individual by themselves probably wasn't going to be wildly successful. But if you took all the ideas that people had and that drove your design decisions, your implementation decisions, and you used the strength of the team, you were far better off than my previous model. Right. So it was really a wake-up call for me on that you can succeed with any team in front of you.
Right.
If you can't, you need to reassess yourself and figure out how to be a better coach.
Right.
And a better teacher. Remember, coaching and teaching, you got to be a better teacher.
Right. So we talked about a lot of good management tips so far I got from you. Tell me about the worst management advice you got from somebody. I'm sure you had a lot of mentors and managers.
Now this is an interesting one, and this comes from the Brain Rules books. I love brain books. We're in an era where you can understand how your brain works and stuff like that.
Right.
And I tend to forget a lot of that. So when I hear something that I think is complete garbage and incompatible with my model, like some managers, you got to control the team, you got to control, forget all that.
Right.
The reality of it is you got to empower. Usually the bad advice is more around control. It's sort of more around you and not about your team. It's got to be team first. Anything that's not team first, I have no interest in.
Right.
Because in fact, the reason you hire people is for them to do their best work. And your job is to not screw it up.
Right.
And so ideally what you're able to do is inspire people to do their best work, and maybe the output goes more than it would if you weren't there. But in the worst case, a lot of times managers interfere with their own teams. They hurt their own teams. They move priorities around. They change their mind. They're inconsistent. You can demoralize just like hope is a force multiplier, or inspiration or optimism is a force multiplier. Negativity and down, you can pull the team down to your level as well.
You're right.
So I think anything that sort of conflicts with empowering. And it may be that different people in situational leadership, you'll find that different people have a different level of maturity. So you might not want to take somebody who's really junior, okay, you're empowered to design it. No, that's setting them up to fail. What you have to do is pair them with somebody that does have that skill set to be able to develop it. So a lot of this is sort of pairing people together and connecting them together so that they can develop each other and learn from one another.
True.
So it's not empowerment without bound. It's looking situationally as where are they at and what do they need to be the best version of themselves.
Right.
If they're learning something new, let's pair them up with somebody that has deeper expertise on that and help them get great at that particular space. If they're already an expert in that area, they call it like level 3 or level 4, they're a deep expert, stay the heck out of the way.
True.
Recognize them as the thought leader, have them share with the rest of the team, and what you're trying to do is raise the water level of your organization.
Yes.
The water level of your organization is achieved when everybody feels comfortable sharing their ideas and thoughts and bringing their thoughts to play.
True. So tell me about the best advice on management you heard in your life, which you take. Like I have one best advice from you: get the heck out of the way.
I always keep hitting on that empower. First Break All the Rules is a good book that talks about empowerment. That was some book in the early days. It was a really good one. John Wooden's book on leadership, Coach of the Century, is my favorite because he teaches you how to develop professional love for your teams. You have to get a deep-seated appreciation and respect for the work that they do. And so for me, it's all about coaching each individual, teaching each individual, developing each individual, and having them in position where they can succeed, and also in a perfect world being able to have opportunities to stretch them.
Right.
And again, notice you're going to not put limits on them that are your own limits, but you also don't want to stretch them so that they're set up for failure. So you can have that honest discussion with somebody and say, hey, here's what's needed for this role. We're doing a financial data engineering role, which has these new dimensions to it. Is this something you're comfortable with?
Right.
How much, we see that this is a stretch. This is something that's going to be a big stretch for you and going to be out of your comfort zone. Is that something you want to take on at this point in time? Because what you want is you want to develop the whole person. In other words, you don't want to have somebody that just comes in, does great work for a couple of years, burns out, and then is sick of the business and doesn't want to do it. So, obviously you want people to have fun, enjoy what they're doing, and own their professional development. Own their own career, own their professional development, own where they want to go and where they want to develop themselves. If you can get people to look at themselves so that you don't have to be doing it as much,
right,
and they can look at themselves and then make decisions as to where they want to go, how do they want to get there, then they're on a good path.
Right. So, Mike, I know you are an engineer from your heart. How important the coding skill is when you start growing up, say you become CTO or a director of engineering? How important coding skill still needed there in that position? Because I have a lot of argument with a lot of people. That's why I asked this question to all senior managers.
This is hotly debated. And like I said, I love differing points of view. But I'll tell you what my point of view in it.
Sure.
You always want to be doing level appropriate work. Level appropriate work. If I'm the CEO, is writing code, is writing my 5 lines of code a day of crappy code because my skills are completely obsolete.
Right.
Is that level appropriate work?
Yeah.
Right? In other words, how am I going to get promoted? In other words, what if I put this on, I want to be promoted because I wrote 5 lines of code yesterday that broke. I mean, really? So I think it depends. You say, well, where's an answer? It depends. If you were in a startup, right, where people need it, that it's needed, you just do whatever's needed to do the job. And frankly, I love people to write code every day. That would be my preference because you're staying deep in the technology, but you're superficial.
Right.
So my preference tends to be is I want somebody like an architect or somebody that's a principal or a staff engineer on my team that is the master of coding, that does it 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, and is the master. They're far superior than I would ever be.
Right.
That doesn't mean I don't want to read the code, look at the code, have a real understanding of what goes on, how hard is it to integrate, those kind of things. But in terms of writing code every day, and I'll tell you, I remember the day in my career. I can remember the day, I don't remember the year, but I remember the day I was sitting in my office, and my goal and what I'd always said to people, never stop coding. Never stop coding, because the number of doors that are open for you gets closed when you stop coding. Because a lot of places want their managers to code.
Right.
Why? Because they want them to be technical. Well, that sort of ensures that they're technical. They might not be technical in the right areas, but they're certainly technical in something. It shows a passion for writing code.
True.
And of course, developers love that because that's what their language of communication is. So that's a good language of communication. I just thought of a story that I got to share it.
Sure.
I'll share a story. I didn't think of this one. When I was at Huawei in China, I didn't speak any Mandarin, and the teammates that I had and stuff weren't speaking English. But you know,
so you were there for 2 years?
A year and a half.
Year and a half.
Year and a half.
Okay.
Year and a half. Amazing experience, incredible experience, best time of my life. And it's kind of an architect type role. And I was developing the next generation of developers. Huawei put a huge value on developing people. So I was really aligned with what they do. Their philosophy is develop people. And let's see, where was I going with that? And so, these folks commit themselves to learning, and they're constantly studying.
Right.
I'm trying to think of where I was.
You were talking about coding skill.
Oh yeah. Okay. So here's the language. So I don't speak Mandarin.
Right.
My teammates don't speak English, but they speak JavaScript. So I learned to code. This was funny. I didn't learn to code. I was still coding, but I was writing code to communicate what I wanted in terms of requirements. So I would code up an example in PowerShell or JavaScript or whatever the language was, or Java, whatever the language around.
Yeah.
So I would code up an example, and they would look at that. Now I understand what you want.
Right.
Because me describing what I wanted in English was completely ineffective.
Right.
It wasn't easy. And so we used programming language as the neutral language to communicate. The second thing I used was testing use cases. So the combination of some code examples. Now, I didn't consider myself a quality coder at that point, but I could still write code, but I could do it well enough to get the communication of what I wanted across.
Right.
And then they would productionize it, right?
Right.
And then I would say, what are the use cases and how do you test the use cases? So I put together a test scenario. Here's the test matrix for how we're going to test the system. From that, they understood what we needed to build. So the interesting thing was I used code it was the uniform language. The common language was not English or Mandarin. The common language was JavaScript and PowerShell, those kind of things. Isn't that crazy?
Yeah.
You're like really using code as yes, it works brilliantly for engineers. And they loved it because they're like, this dude, this senior dude is writing code. So they thought it was kind of cool. But the important point was it was used as a communication tool.
Right. No, so my the reasoning to ask that, of course I don't expect CTO to write code because that's really
should be able to read it.
Should be able to read it, understand the right design, like where the the chief architect comes and gives you something, because I think that's very important for senior managers, leadership of engineering, to understand those things. Because I see the young guys, they run after any shiny object.
That's right.
Right?
Yes.
They'll say, oh, this is a new platform release, let's do everything there and let's write everything in F#, because it's a new language on the block. So in that sense, I think I feel at least it's very important for senior engineering leader to understand the technology.
Absolutely.
Should be able to read the
which
code
is different
too.
from being when I think of coding, I want a professional that's teaching the rest of the team. And
true.
so I'm not going to be the one teaching them how to best implement the latest language and latest feature, but you're right. What I call is a working knowledge.
True.
You need a working knowledge of the design, the coding, the APIs. What I care about really is the data model and the interfaces.
Yes.
Is the data model that we're using reflective of reality? Can we properly model? Because if the data model's off, you're in deep trouble.
Yes.
So if you get the data model right, and then we want a staff engineer, principal engineer, or architect type that is state-of-the-art in terms of their coding skills.
Right.
So what they can do is they can actually teach the code and develop the next generation of engineers to be great coders.
True.
So I think it has value, but I wouldn't put such a huge amount of time on it that I'm taking away from my team. So let me finish the story when I was saying I woke up in my office. So I woke up in my office and I'm like, okay, tomorrow I'm going to stop writing code every day. The reason is I had a team of almost 100.
Right.
So I looked at the size of the team and the amount of teaching that I was going to need to do and the amount of business interaction that I was going to need to do, and I realized that I'm not doing level appropriate work. So that was the decision. Now, that doesn't mean I didn't read other code and check the check-ins and look at stuff, but I realized that my greatest value was writing lines of code day to day was my greatest value, production code.
True.
But I certainly wouldn't discourage anybody from doing it because it'll keep them more employable.
Exactly. Yeah.
Because they're developing their skills, they're becoming comfortable. And like I've always said, if you can do it, here's the other dimension. If it's a hobby, some people love writing code.
Yeah.
So I say, bless you, do it. Because if that's your hobby, go do it. But if you have a different hobby that's not aligned with tech, so it's something away from that, you've got a limited amount of hours. And so you've got to figure out how many hours do I have and how much level appropriate work can I do during those hours.
Right.
And then also, what do I have in the team? In other words, that function has to be there. You need a world-class coder in your team that can teach the rest of them, the rest of us, right?
True.
And so you have to have that. And that ideally probably isn't also the manager, because they're probably going to take time away that they should be doing to develop these other folks' careers.
True.
So that would be the balance. But I'm going to make sure you have somebody on the team that has spectacular state-of-the-art skills. But you got to know the design, you got to know the interfaces, you got to know the adopters, what their experience is. I heard Jay mention make sure you eat your own dog food. Absolutely.
Right.
So you're experiencing what your customers experience, because if you feel their pain, you will fix those things that are causing them pain. If you don't feel their pain, you're unlikely to fix it.
Of course. Cool. So, Mike, in our talk, you did mention many times different books, but I would still like to know a couple of books which influenced you most.
Yep. So started with First Break All the Rules, which was kind of some fundamental things like teaching you that it's okay to get close to your employees. You need to have it's okay to be connected.
Right.
John Wooden has this that states you need to have a professional love for your employees. And there's a benefit that you get when you do that, because it becomes more like a family, where you really care about them, you really care about their career, you really care about their development, you really want them to get promoted, to get new opportunities, to get growth, because it could change their future family and their future generations.
Right.
Can go to better opportunities are made available that might not be available otherwise.
Right.
So I start with First Break All the Rules, and I would say John Wooden's leadership techniques is really, really good. I like Ray Dalio's, who's one of Bill Gates' favorite, which is sort of principles. It's a lot of tremendous guiding principles. One of them that comes to mind that I'll mention, because I love this one, is we normally think when we make a decision of first order effects. What are the obvious effects? The first order effect of not doing documentation would be, hey, it takes less time, I get the software out there. What are the secondary and tertiary order effects? What happens when you have turnover? What's your story when you have turnover? What happens when you have brain drain? Where the people with those expertise leave, and now you got software that's undocumented that nobody can figure out and have a clue of how it works. Right? So you've got to think beyond just the direct first order effects and dig a little deeper. Go to multiple levels of effects. I love a Brain Rules book, which is a good one about sort of understanding people's capacity and how they think. And they call it theory of mind, to try to understand how other people think, to be able to, we have our own framework of how we view the world. What if you could kind of get a feel for what other people value? That would help you in having discussion, certainly help you in influencing. If you kind of understand what's important to each other person you're working with, you have a better chance. A book I saw mentioned on one of the sessions was, How to Win Friends and Influence Enemies, I think it was. That's a classic. That's one that there's a lot of great joy. A recent one, The Obstacle is the Way, where you learn how to pivot your mindset because we can get down when we face obstacle after obstacle. Brilliant book on pivoting obstacles into opportunities. And it changes the way you view the world. Any book that changes the way you fundamentally view the world is the ones to me that I like. I want to mention one other thing out of the Brain Rules book, which is really a good one, because we remember talking about teaching and coaching. One of the statements the author makes, which I love, is what's obvious to you is obvious to you. Remember, we always use the term common sense. Common to who? It's common to you. That doesn't mean it's common to anybody else. Now, let's talk about where this is fatally flawed when it comes to the teacher-student relationship. If you look at the way that we teach, what happens if the teacher's teaching a room of, say, 5 folks, and one of the people is struggling? We blame the student. Why? We blame the student. It's actually the teacher's fault. It's only when the teacher takes on the responsibility of teaching a student that wants to be taught. So let's be clear. You have a student that wants to be taught, and your mechanisms for teaching aren't working. Take ownership. Don't point the finger at that student. You point the finger right back at yourself. What is flawed in my teaching that's causing me to, this person wants to learn. They want to learn. They want to develop. They want to grow, and I'm not teaching them. So I would then look and say, what is it about my teaching that's causing it to fail? What's the fatal flaw in the way that I'm teaching? But notice how that's a role reversal. Think about colleges. They blame the students. I teach this way, you're supposed to learn this way. It's common sense. No, that's nonsense. Each person, a lot of people learn in different ways. And so the magic is when the teacher is able to find the proper way for each student. And sometimes you can do 80%, but you're never going to get 100% with one style. You're going to have to learn to be able to adapt your teaching style to the need of each student and where they're at in terms of their learning. And you want to build their fundamentals and their foundation.
Perfect.
But isn't that weird that you change? It's role reversal. So we always blame the student. Oh, that student's no good. No, I would say the same thing with a hire. When you think you've made a bad hire, take a look at yourself. And I'll give you another tip here. Are you ready for this? When you make a decision, make the best decision you can make on the evidence that you have at that moment in time. Once you've made the decision, you're all in. So once you've made the decision, make the best of the decision you did make. So you make the best decision you can make with the data you have, and then once you've done that, you make the best of the decision you did make. You don't look back. Because what happens is people are self-fulfilling. You see self-fulfilling prophecy all over the place. They don't agree with the decision. So they don't really disagree and commit. They really are trying to undermine it. So in fact, they can prove their point that it was fatally flawed, rather than going with something they disagree with and say, once I'm in, I'm all in. So this is the path we're going. I'm going to do everything within my power and the rest of my team's power to find a way to make it successful. If it ultimately fails, maybe it was the wrong decision, but it's not because I didn't go in 100% to try to make it successful. And that's a very hard ego pivot to make, that you have a strong argument for the way you want it to go, to adopt somebody else's very different decision, and then to put 100% of your energy behind it and everything you think of to make it successful. And what you'll find is you make very few bad decisions, because usually they're not mutually exclusive. There's usually a way to make almost any decision very successful. So that's really a takeaway. That's only the last couple of years I've made that pivot.
No, that's very, very good advice. Thank you very much. So Mike, it was absolute pleasure of mine to speak to you. Go ahead.
You got one more. I remember it on your sheet, which was, what do we tell new engineers?
Yes.
What's the silver bullet to becoming a principal engineer in record time? And people say, there's no silver bullet. Actually, there is. There is a silver bullet. And here's what it is. Now, On the Microsoft.com site, there's a site called Patterns and Practices.
Right.
And what the purpose of that was, and that was done back in the late 90s, early 2000s.
Right.
And here's what the goal of that was, and that's what I use as the core of my teaching with all the engineers I work with. I love patterns and practices. And Microsoft just happened to do a great job of documenting these. And what happened is Microsoft Research was going out into the world of software and studying all the work that had been done, the great work that had been done by, there's so many great engineers that have come before us.
True.
So many great engineers. And was formally documenting those into a series of standardized patterns and practices that had boundaries around them. You know what that's doing? What that's doing is magic. What that's doing is it's putting the same discipline in software as exists in classic engineering. In classic engineering, when you make a mistake, in aviation, a plane may fall out of the air and people, get killed. When you make a mistake on bridges, the bridge may fail. So classic engineering has high cost of mistakes. We get lazy in software, right? We talk about this artistic software. I'm not a big believer in the artistic software nonsense.
True.
It should be an engineering discipline.
Yep.
And what this is doing is saying, put the discipline back in engineering. Let's understand what everybody did before us, understand what they did, and understand all the mistakes. What are the risks and mitigations? How do you mitigate those? And I'm gonna tell you what this does. And you, like I said, find that on Microsoft.com, Patterns and Practices site. Amazon has a builder's library, which I also like to stitch in. Google has great material. There's so much incredible material on the web, unlike any era we ever lived in, okay?
True.
But what it does is allows you to formalize the way that you learn. You're able to formalize the foundation. This also ties in with Elon Musk's strategy of understanding, which is you must understand the fundamentals. True. The reason this dude is able to go industry by industry by industry and master those is he masters the fundamentals.
Yeah.
He boils down, the genius that he has is boiling down the noise and getting to the signal. What is the important part that you have to learn? For example, a cache aside pattern. So I was using cache aside pattern 40 years ago. It's documented, you understand it, and then you understand, well, what are the trade-offs with cache aside pattern? What's my cache startup strategy? What's my eviction strategy? You always factor in the CAP theorem, consistency, availability, partition tolerance, right? How long is the eventual consistency?
Right.
So these are all the kinds of things that you add there, and here's what you're doing. If you think about a normal engineer's path, especially in this era, they'll work a couple years at a place, they'll move and work a couple years, and when they're bouncing around, oftentimes changing domains, they're learning 3 or 4 patterns and practices at each stop.
True.
After a period of 12, 15 years, all of a sudden, they have this broad base of expertise. They have this incredible foundation of patterns. They make great design decisions and great implementation decisions.
Right.
So that's how they develop. Now, what's the fast path to that? We're going to master what they've already learned. So we're going right to what they already know. So we're going to the end game, which is here's the pattern, here's the mitigations, and here's the trade-offs that you need to make. And when you're doing a design or an implementation, you go right back to the patterns and check. You do it as a checklist.
Right.
What are my trade-offs? So you don't miss stuff, because it's not that you won't get it right eventually, is you won't get it right in version 1. Imagine if your MVP is as good as your version 5.
Yes.
Now that's the magic. Now, you know what you've done? You now have the fast path to getting promoted. And I can tell you, there's been at least 20 examples of people that have gone with this for me. Their next job, several of them have doubled their money or more.
Right.
It's crazy.
This is a very good tip you gave. I remember they had a book also came out of
Beautiful
that
Cloud Patterns and Practices
website.
book.
Yeah. I think that book scared a lot of people because it was very thick book.
Oh yeah, I read it.
So I remember having that book too.
Yes.
And
I read it cover to cover, by the way.
Yeah. See, that's what people miss. I am sure.
Because think about it.
A lot of people may have not completed.
Think about it.
Yeah.
If you don't do that, you're having to make all the same mistakes your predecessors made. Think about classic engineers, engineer electrical, mechanical. They study other engineers. That's all they do is study what other people did and what they learned.
Yeah.
We don't do that in software. So if you do that, I'm going to tell you what you'll see happen in 12 months.
Right.
It's shocking. All of a sudden, you have an engineer 1 year out of college that 12 months later, when they're thinking of designing a system, thinks like a principal engineer. Now, that doesn't mean their implementation will be as good as a principal engineer. So they're
But
not
their
a principal
understanding
engineer
will be there.
But their mental model is the same.
Yeah.
So, and I tried this at Huawei in China, worked brilliantly. It's spectacularly effective. The other dimension to it, here's tip of the day.
Right.
We'll finish with this is
Sure.
whiteboard, 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 whiteboard. The
True.
only skill that matters is your whiteboard skills. If you have a single skill, it needs to be whiteboarding.
True.
And here's what I ask people to do. Get themselves a $12, $15 portable whiteboard.
Yep.
Right? Get it off, whatever. Get your little portable whiteboard.
Right.
And when you're studying a pattern of practice or you're studying something new, you're going to forget 90% of what you read unless you write it down.
Right.
Draw it on the whiteboard. Because think about what's going on there. That's your public interface to the world on what kind of an engineer you are.
Yes.
If you can't whiteboard it, you ain't making principal engineer.
Yeah.
So if you want to get to principal engineer, and here's the beauty of it, and I'm going to tell you what happens to people that do this. All right, here's the deal. When they go into interviews, because I've had that debrief with them afterwards on the next job, first of all, they get every job offer. They beat every other person in the interview. Why? Because their whiteboard skills are unmatched. That is so disproportionately weighted that it doesn't matter what happened in the rest of what happens when they're interviewing with the principal engineer that's on that loop, or the as appropriate interviewer, and they're able to communicate on the whiteboard how they design systems, how they implement systems, what the trade-offs are of those systems. And publicly, they go, you know what? Not only can this person do the work, but they can educate the next generation. Here's what happens. So remember that person I said that was considered one of the weakest engineers? The next job, principal money.
Wow.
Unloaded a wheelbarrow full of money right at his feet. Right? Now, they couldn't give him a principal title because everybody else in the company is going to quit.
Right.
But they gave him principal money.
Principal
So we're talking tripling your money in one job change.
This should be the headline for this our interview, this segment, that become a principal engineer within a year, and which is like almost impossible. Mentally, yeah.
Mentally,
yeah.
Now I don't want to disrespect real principal engineers who got there the hard way.
Yeah, yep.
Okay, it's not meant to disrespect, but they didn't have to make all the mistakes to avoid all the mistakes.
True, true.
They're able to deliver with fewer mistakes in the early versions, which means more output in less time, which means more value to the company, which means you need to be paid more.
True.
So you're increasing your value relative to the company, and so you should be compensated. And you know what your skill level should be on the whiteboard when you have mastery? You should be, this is the analogy I use. You know how smooth a grand pianist is on the piano?
Yep.
That needs to be you on the whiteboard.
Yeah.
When you look like a grand piano player, when you're communicating with somebody on a whiteboard, you're now on a good path. Because if you, I don't care who you interview with, when they see that, they're like principal engineer aboard. Right. Period. Nothing else matters. On the flip side is, you can be here's what I'll say. The best engineer doesn't get hired. Right. The best engineer that communicates the best on the skills that they have gets hired. Right. And so if you can out-communicate all the competition, you'll win every time.
True, true. I'm smiling because I'm just thinking.
How can you not hire somebody that's a spectacular on the whiteboard? True. Because we know that's the hardest skill in engineering. Yes. So the hardest skill in engineering they've mastered. Right. So your mind says there's no way they can be this good. True. But your eyes, the eye test says they are this good. Yeah. So what you end up doing is you say, you know what, we got to pay. Right. We can't give them the title because we'll demoralize, but you know what? We can give them the cash. Right. And so the goal of this is to help next generations, help them make a good living and do great work at doing it. And they'll earn it while they're doing it.
Perfect. I was just smiling because I was thinking maybe this is, your training did this to me when I went to this new job. First thing I noticed that there's no whiteboard in the office. And oh my goodness. I said, I want a whiteboard. And everybody was looking at me funny that you are the CTO. Why you need whiteboard?
You got it.
And I kept on pounding the table that I want a whiteboard till I got one. So it's very interesting.
Think about the magic. Think about I thought it was important, back in the time when we were together, but nowhere near as important as I realized it is now. Right. Because I've realized from literally so many interviews that you'll never lose an interview if you're the best on the whiteboard. You can't lose. Yes. Because that skill is so much harder than think about it. You've only got an hour with 3 or 4 people. Right. So you've probably got, 60 quality minutes. You're up there describing what you've designed, how you designed it, what the patterns and practices are that are in play. Here's the other beauty of patterns and practices. They're platform independent. They're framework independent. Right. They're language independent. How many things can you learn in computing that last for eternity? Cache aside, I've been using it 40 years ago. It's the same now as it was then. Now, the reference implementation or the best implementation of cache aside will be better today than it was back 30 years ago. True. But the pattern hasn't moved. So how many times can you study something that never ages? True. Everything we study is aging out, right? It has a use-by date. Pattern practice has no use-by date.
Yes, yes.
And then you tie it in. You go to Amazon site, which has a builder's network. You start studying the examples that go. Google has tremendous documentation on Bigtable, all kinds of cool stuff they built. Yep. Incredible. You can spend a lifetime mastering technology that's publicly accessible on the internet, follow your favorite friends on blogs and stuff like that, and become the best engineer you can possibly be. True. And then you have to be able to communicate it on the whiteboard. If you can't, then that puts a fundamental ceiling on from an engineering standpoint. It doesn't affect you on the management path. But on the engineering path, if you want to get to principal engineer, you want to get to CTO, you want to get to J, you want to be the big dog, you got to be the master of the whiteboard.
True. Absolutely. I agree with you. So, Mike, thank you very much. Before I say thank you to you, I would like to have another request to you, which is like, you should quit your job and become a coach. Because I think you are a tremendous coach, and I think you affected so many dev managers and leads in Microsoft. So I think you can bring a lot of value to be a coach. So, and I'm waiting for the day you will say, I'm a coach, so I can go back to you and learn something more from you. So thank you very much, Mike, for taking time and speaking to us. Thank you.
Yeah, like I said, I've been doing this I started when I was 17, so the first computer came into my high school, and at that day I knew what I wanted to do the rest of my life. I always loved software. Like I said, it was drug kicking and screaming out of writing code every day, but I still enjoy reading it, looking and seeing what other people have solved. And someday I will get into coaching and stuff, professionally developing people, because to me that's the greatest joy I get. When I see somebody else that has success, gets promoted, gets advancement, gets a new opportunity, it makes my week. I mean, I've learned to get a joy there that's still not quite the same as writing code, but it's close. It's close. It is great joy. I mean, you got to love it, right? You're on LinkedIn, somebody advances, they get promoted to a new opportunity, and you're like, oh man, I'm so excited. And the fact that you played some small role in that, brings a level, and you know what it does? It potentially sets them and their family up for great success and financial support for many, many years to come. You can build new generations of developers. And it's a fast path to getting imagine the career earnings difference. If you master patterns of practice and whiteboarding in early years, you're going to double or triple your promotion velocity. So there's nothing like it.
Agree.
And do it.
Yeah, cool. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Much appreciated.
Yeah, welcome.